Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on Classics in Neuroscience. In this series of videos, we'll look at learning and memory, the contributions of Donald Hebb, Brenda Milner and Hebb to help improve our understanding of learning and memory. In the last video, we looked at the contributions of Carl Lashley and how Carl Lashley was inspired or excited by Laurent Deno's circuitry that showed reverberating circuits, and thought maybe that could function as a mechanism to help explain memory and learning. In this video, we will focus our attention on Donald Hebb and Hebb's postulate. So, Donald Hebb was a student of Carl Lashley. He obtained his PhD in 1936. He studied at McGill. He was a school principal before being drawn to research in psychology. He was inspired by the works of the earlier psychologists, the pioneers like William James, James Watson and Sigmund Freud. So, he joined the Montreal Neurological Institute to study the effect of frontal lobe injury on human behavior. When there is an injury in the frontal lobe, how does it affect the human behavior? He concluded that the minimal effects on behavior meant that the neural systems involved in behavior were rather widely distributed as opposed to localization. There was widely distributed neural systems. That's what he found. He then joined as faculty in Queen's University and he developed intelligence tests for rats. He also developed it for humans. By around 1942, he was thoroughly convinced that learning was a critical factor in intelligence than what was commonly recognized. Learning was a critical factor in intelligence. Donald Hebb joined Lashley at Yerkes laboratory and started studying the behavior of chimpanzees. He then wrote the book which is called as the Organization of Behavior, a neuropsychological theory in 1949. This book became a cornerstone, became a landmark work in the field of cognitive neuroscience, or perhaps it can even be argued that this book practically invented or developed or inspired the field of cognitive neuroscience or cognitive psychology. Just like Carl Lashley, Donald Hebb was also excited or inspired by Laurent Deno's diagram that showed reverberatory circuits. But Donald Hebb was more interested in focusing his attention on synapses directly. He was interested in understanding how learning happens at the level of synapses. Unlike Lashley, Hebb's attention was on synaptic level learning or synaptic learning. Remember, in the 1940s until late 1940s or early 1950s, there was practically no information about the properties of the central neurons or how do synapses function. There was no idea of how membrane potentials function, or there was no clarity on membrane physiology. There was no description of the fine structural details within the cell. There was also no description of how neurons communicate with each other. Such neurotransmitter systems were not described in detail. Also, there was not even one recording from a cortical cell in humans. Also, there was no bioactive substances. None of these things were available in the 1940s. So, for Hebb to come up with this book in the 1949 is truly extraordinary, because at that time there was practically no physiological data available to support Hebb's idea. It is a new idea in the true sense of the word new. Hebb described his ideas in his work In chapter 4, he describes his postulates. He suggested that there are at least 4 major concepts or principles or postulates. First is the notion of Hebbian synapse. This suggested the following: when an axon of cell A is near enough to excite cell B and repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both the cells such that A's efficiency as one of the cells that fires B is increased. That is, if 2 neurons communicate with each other, let us say I am going to call this A and I am going to call this B, A is firing B. If they repeatedly and persistently A is firing B, then the efficiency with which A can cause an action potential in B is increased. Some growth process or metabolic change, he did not know the exact details, he said some metabolic change takes place in one, it can happen either in A or in B, it can happen in either of the 2 cells. This metabolic change that happens increases the efficiency with which A can fire B. In other words, learning happens when correlated increases occur in both pre and post synaptic activity. That is, there must be an increase in activation levels of both the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. When that happens repeatedly and persistently, then there must be some form of metabolic change or growth process that will lead to an increase in efficiency. This is how learning happens at the level of the synapses. And the cells that are active together form what is called as a cell assembly. Popularly, this is known as the cells that fire together, wired together. They are hardwired. Cells that work together are wired together. There is a hardwired connection between cells that fire together. Cells that fire together, wired together. This. In Hebb schema, there was also reverberatory activity that was suggested by Laurentino's diagrams that persists after the initial input. Thus, it enables the particular cell assembly to continue to represent the triggering event. So, there is an initial input that causes a reverberatory activity, but the reverberatory activity continues for some time, right. So, the cell assembly continues to represent that original triggering activity. The original triggering event or the original triggering stimulus might have disappeared, but that caused the reverberatory activity. Even some time after the disappearance of the original stimulus, the reverberatory activity essentially is a representation of the stimulus. Then the nature of mental activity. Different cell assemblies that are activated in different sequences essentially forms the substrate of thinking. This was a revolutionary idea because for a behaviorist, idea was a psychological concept that had no physiological substrate. There is no neural substrate for thinking or ideas. For a behaviorist, an idea was a purely psychological concept that had no physiological or neural foundation. But Donald Hebb's idea was truly revolutionary because it suggested that sequence in which cells fire essentially constitutes the neural substrate of thinking, suggesting that there is actually a neurophysiological basis for an idea or for thinking. All these ideas had great repercussions in the field of neuropsychology, neurophysiology or psychological physiology. It had far-reaching consequences in the field of cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology. So, its first effects were felt in psychology. helping to counterbalance pure behaviorism, which said that the brain is a black box and I don't care about what happens, there is an input and there is an output, that is all we care about, right. So this provided a healthy alternative or a healthy counterbalance to the aggressive behavioral stance taken by behaviorism, and stimulate the rise of physiological psychology and psychobiology in the 1960s and 1970s. Until as late as 1970s, these ideas were not experimentally supported. Only in the 1970s, the idea of long-term potentiation was supported by experiments. Until then, these remained just ideas that were being tested. All of these works and all of these ideas essentially gave birth to the field of cognitive neuroscience. The work of Donald Hebb was so crucial for many scientists that they even suggested that after the work of Darwin on Origin of Species, maybe we can consider Donald Hebb's book as the next major milestone book that completely changed the way we think about how we form memories and how we learn. With this, we come to the end of this video. In this video, we looked at the seminal and crucial contributions of Donald Hebb and his postulates, and how his ideas essentially gave birth to the field of modern cognitive neuroscience. With this, we come to the end of this video. Thank you for your attention.